Amy Peterson sat nervously in her cramped Georgetown apartment, staring at the email that had just arrived on her laptop screen. The blue light illuminated her face in the dimly lit room as she read the message for the third time. As the newly appointed White House press secretary at only 27 years old, she had expected scrutiny, but not this kind of attention. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert had invited her to appear as a guest next week. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered how to respond. The spring evening air drifted through her half-open window, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the sweet scent of cherry blossoms. Amy closed her laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the Washington skyline. 6 months ago, she had been a relatively unknown communications aide. Now she was the youngest press secretary in American history, the face and voice of the administration. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Greg Wilson, the White House communications director. "Did you see the email?" Greg asked. "When?" she answered. "I'm looking at it right now," Amy replied, returning to her laptop. "What do you think?" "I think it's an opportunity we can't pass up," Greg said. His voice had the confident tone he always used when delivering what he thought was good news. "The president thinks you should do it," Amy sighed, twirling a strand of her blonde hair around her finger. "Greg, Colbert isn't exactly friendly to our administration. His audience boos at the mere mention of the president's name." "That's exactly why this matters," Greg insisted. "This is your chance to reach across the aisle to speak directly to people who wouldn't normally listen to us." The president specifically said, and I quote, "Amy can handle herself. Let her show the country what she's made of." The weight of the president's confidence pressed on Amy's shoulders. She had spent years working toward this position, climbing through the ranks of political communications with determination that surprised even her most supportive mentors. But television, late-night television especially, was a different beast altogether. "Can I think about it overnight?" Amy asked. "Sure, but I need your answer by 9 tomorrow. The bookers want to confirm," Greg replied before hanging up. Amy put down her phone and opened her laptop again. She typed Colbert political guests into the search bar and spent the next hour watching clips of previous interviews. The pattern was clear. Conservative guests were set up as foils, often interrupted or made the subject of jokes that delighted the studio audience. Still, a few had managed to hold their ground, even earning reluctant respect from the host. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Linda Blackwell, the senior advisor who had championed Amy for the press secretary position. "Heard about Colbert. Call me," the message read. Linda answered on the first ring. Unlike Greg, she didn't start with congratulations. "You know it's a trap, right?" Linda said, her voice calm but direct. "They're not inviting you to have a thoughtful discussion about policy. They want a viral moment at your expense." "I know," Amy admitted, sinking into her couch. "But Greg says the president wants me to do it." "Of course he does," Linda replied. "He believes in you, but you need to go in with your eyes open. This isn't like facing the press corps. At least there, the rules are understood." Amy grabbed a notebook and pen. "So what's your advice? If you're going to do this, and it sounds like you are, then you need to prepare differently," Linda explained. "They'll try to throw you off balance with jokes. Practice not looking flustered. They'll interrupt you. Have short, clear points ready that you can get out quickly. And most importantly, remember why you're there. You're not trying to win over Colbert. You're speaking to the millions of people watching at home." After hanging up, Amy walked to her kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her apartment was small but neat, with framed photos of her family on the walls and political biographies filling a small bookshelf. She looked at a picture of herself as a college student, standing in front of the White House gates during a tour, her face bright with ambition. "Well, you made it inside," she whispered to her younger self. Amy opened her laptop again and started a new document. She titled it Colbert Prep and began listing the topics likely to come up: the controversial tariff policies, immigration enforcement changes, the president's recent clash with the Supreme Court. Next to each topic, she wrote out key points. Not scripted answers, but guideposts to keep her on message without sounding rehearsed. The next morning, Amy arrived at the White House earlier than usual. The security guard at the entrance, Bill, greeted her with a smile. "Big day, Ms. Peterson?" he asked as she showed her ID. "Every day is big around here, Bill," she replied with a smile that hid her anxiety. She headed straight to Greg's office. He was already there, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing for her to come in as he finished his call. "So?" he asked as soon as he hung up. "I'll do the show," Amy said firmly. "But I want Paul Harris to help me prepare." Paul was the administration's best speech consultant, known for his skill at preparing officials for hostile interviews. Greg nodded. "Already arranged, he's clearing his schedule for the next 3 days." 3 days? The show is in a week. "The president wants you well prepared," Greg explained. "This isn't just another media hit. It's a statement." Over the next few days, Amy went through intensive preparation. Paul Harris set up mock interviews, playing Colbert with uncomfortable accuracy, interrupting her answers and throwing curveball questions designed to make her lose her composure. "You're getting better," Paul told her after their 5th session. "But you're still trying to win the argument. That's not the goal here." "What is the goal, then?" Amy asked, frustration edging into her voice. "To show that our side can engage thoughtfully with good humor, even in spaces that aren't friendly to us," Paul explained. "Remember, most Americans are tired of the shouting. They respect people who can disagree without being disagreeable." All right. Night before the show, Amy received a call from the Late Show's producer, Karen Montgomery. "Ms. Peterson, we're looking forward to having you tomorrow," Karen said, her tone professionally warm. "I wanted to go over the schedule and a few logistical details." "Of course," Amy replied, sitting at her kitchen table with a notepad. "We'll send a car for you at 3 p.m. Hair and makeup will be at 4. We tape at 5:30. Your segment is planned for about 7 minutes right after the monologue." 7 minutes, Amy repeated, writing it down. "And the topics, what should I expect?" "Stephen likes to keep things conversational so we don't pre-plan specific questions," Karen explained, little too smoothly. "Obviously, current events will come up." After the call, Amy phoned Greg. "They're being vague about the questions." "That's standard for them," Greg assured her. "Just stick to the prep we've done. You'll be fine." Later that evening, Amy received a text from an unknown number. When she opened it, she saw it was from Jeff Collins, a head writer for The Late Show, whom she'd met years ago during her brief stint in New York media. "Heard you're coming on tomorrow. Heads up, they've extended your segment to 12 minutes and the writing room is calling it the confrontation of the season. Thought you should know." Amy stared at the message, her heart beating faster. She forwarded it to Greg and Linda, then called Paul. 12 minutes, she told him when he answered, and apparently they're planning some kind of confrontation. "That changes things," Paul said after a moment. "More time means more opportunity for them to try different angles, if the first approach doesn't get the reaction they want." "Should I cancel?" Amy asked, voicing the thought that had been circling her mind. "At this point, canceling would look worse than anything that might happen on the show," Paul advised. "But we need to adjust our strategy. Can you come back to the office tonight?" Amy grabbed her jacket. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. As she drove through the Washington streets toward the White House, Amy felt a strange sense of calm replacing her anxiety. If they wanted a confrontation, they would get one, just not the kind they were expecting. She was done preparing to be on the defensive. Tomorrow she would show them exactly why the president had chosen her for this job. The writing room of The Late Show buzzed with activity as Jeff Collins stood at a whiteboard covered with notes and question ideas. 12 writers sat around a long table, laptops open and coffee cups scattered between notepads. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Manhattan office building, but no one was paying attention to the beautiful spring day outside. "Okay, people, this is our chance," Jeff said, circling a phrase on the whiteboard that read, "Tariff contradictions. We've got the youngest press secretary in history coming on tonight, and we need to make this count." Karen Montgomery, the show's senior producer, leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed. "Just remember, we need moments that work for both television and social media clips. Questions that she can't answer with rehearsed talking points. What about starting friendly and then hitting her with the border detention statistics?" suggested Ryan Nichols, one of the newer writers. She won't expect us to lead with that. Too obvious, Jeff replied, shaking his head. She'll have prepared for all the usual hot-button issues. We need something unexpected. Samantha Reed, another producer, entered the room with a tablet in her hand. I've been watching her press briefings. She has a pattern when she's uncomfortable. She tilts her head slightly and repeats the question before answering. If we see that, we know we've hit a nerve. In another part of the building, Stephen Colbert sat in his office reviewing the planned questions for Amy Peterson. His executive producer, Frank Mitchell, stood nearby. These are good, Colbert said, flipping through the pages. But I'm not looking to ambush her. I want a real conversation. Of course, Frank nodded. But remember, she's not coming here to have a friendly chat. She has an agenda, and so do we. My agenda is to put on a good show, Colbert replied, setting down the papers. If she gives thoughtful answers, I'll give her the space to do that. If she gives me talking points, then we'll have to push harder. Frank checked his watch. She arrives in 4 hours. The pre-interview is scheduled for 15 minutes before hair and makeup. Just enough time to make her comfortable. Not enough time for her to prepare for any curveballs. Meanwhile, Amy sat in a secure conference room at the White House with Paul Harris and Linda Blackwell. 3 empty coffee cups sat on the table, evidence of their late night and early morning. A small television played a muted press briefing from the previous week, with Amy at the podium. Let's go over it again, Paul said, his voice showing signs of fatigue. If he brings up the president's comments about the judiciary, I explain the difference between criticizing decisions and attacking the institution, Amy recited. The president respects the separation of powers but believes the recent ruling overstepped constitutional boundaries. Good, Linda nodded. And the steel tariffs? I acknowledge the short-term price increases but pivot to the long-term benefits for American manufacturing workers and national security, Amy replied. If pressed, I have the employment numbers from the 3 states most affected. Paul stood up and paced the room. Remember, he'll try to interrupt you. Don't let him control the entire conversation, but don't appear defensive either. It's a delicate balance. The door opened, and Greg Wilson walked in, looking concerned. I just got word from our contact at the network. They've scheduled 12 minutes for your segment without telling us, and they've rearranged the question Stephen was planning to ask. Can they do that? Amy asked. It's their show, Linda replied with a frown. They can do whatever they want. Greg pulled up a chair. This changes things. With 12 minutes, they have time to really dig into topics, circle back to your answers, and press you on details. Amy took a deep breath. So what's the new strategy? Be ready to pivot, Paul advised. If a line of questioning is going nowhere good, find a natural way to shift to one of our stronger topics. And don't be afraid to gently challenge the premise of unfair questions. At 2:30 p.m., Amy left the White House wearing a navy blue suit with a subtle pinstripe. She had chosen it carefully. Professional but not severe. Conservative but not old-fashioned. The car sent by the show waited at the entrance. As they drove through the city toward the airport for her flight to New York, Amy's phone rang. It was the president. Amy, the familiar voice said. I hear they're planning to make things difficult for you tonight. Yes, sir, she replied. But I'm prepared. I know you are, the president said. That's why I chose you for this job. But remember, something important. You're not just defending our policies tonight. You're showing the American people that we can engage respectfully with those who disagree with us. That matters more than winning any particular point. I understand, sir. Good luck. We'll all be watching. The car arrived at the airport, and Amy boarded the short flight to New York. She used the time to review her notes one last time, then closed her eyes for a brief rest. The plane landed at LaGuardia Airport at 3:45 p.m., and another car took her directly to the Ed Sullivan Theater. As Amy walked into the backstage area, she felt the eyes of the production staff following her. Some looked curious, others almost hostile. A young woman approached her with a clipboard. Ms. Peterson, I'm Diane Foster, one of the assistant producers. Welcome to The Late Show. We're so glad to have you. The words were friendly, but Amy detected a coolness in Diane's eyes that contradicted her welcome. "Thank you," Amy replied with a practiced smile. "I'm looking forward to the conversation." "Of course," Diane said, leading her down a hallway. "Let me show you to your dressing room. We have hair and makeup ready for you, and then Stephen would like to have a quick chat before the show." The dressing room was small but comfortable, with a couch, a makeup chair, and a television showing a feed from the stage where crew members were making final adjustments. Amy sat in the makeup chair as two stylists worked on her hair and makeup, speaking to each other as if she wasn't there. "Big night tonight," one of them said to the other. "Should be interesting." "Yeah, I heard the writers have been working overtime on this one," the other replied with a small laugh. Amy pretended not to hear them, instead checking her phone for any last-minute messages from her team. There was one from Paul. "Remember, you belong there as much as anyone. Don't let them make you feel otherwise." At 5:15 p.m., Diane returned to escort Amy to a small meeting room where Colbert waited. The host stood as she entered, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine. "Ms. Peterson, thank you for coming on the show," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you for having me," Amy replied, matching his grip and smile. "I know these conversations can sometimes be tense," Colbert continued, gesturing for her to sit. "But I hope we can have a substantive discussion tonight, even where we disagree." "That's my hope as well," Amy said, taking the offered seat. "Just so you know," Colbert explained, "we may touch on the tariff policies, immigration, and possibly the president's recent comments about the Supreme Court. Does that sound fair?" Amy nodded, noting that these were exactly the topics she had prepared for. Either their leaked information about changes was wrong, or Colbert wasn't showing all his cards. "Perfectly fair," she replied. "I look forward to discussing those issues and clarifying our administration's positions." "Excellent," Colbert said, standing. "We're on in about 15 minutes. Diane will come get you when it's time." As he left, Amy noticed a script on the table that he had partially covered with a folder. She could just make out a handwritten note in the margin. "Push hard on Qatar jet if time permits." Amy quickly pulled out her phone and texted Greg. "They may bring up Qatar. Get me talking points now." She had just put her phone away when Diane returned to the room. "It's time, Ms. Peterson," she said. "Ready for your television debut?" Amy stood, straightened her jacket, and gave Diane her most confident smile. "Absolutely, let's do this." The bright lights of the Ed Sullivan Theater stage felt warm on Amy's face as she walked out to enthusiastic, but clearly obligatory applause. The studio audience, a sea of curious faces, watched her with a mix of interest and suspicion. Stephen Colbert greeted her with a wide smile and a handshake before they both took their seats. Amy smoothed her skirt and returned the smile, looking more relaxed than she felt. "Welcome to the show, Press Secretary Peterson," Colbert said, turning slightly to face her. "Or may I call you Amy?" "Amy is fine," she replied, keeping her voice steady and friendly. "Thank you for having me." "So you're the youngest press secretary in American history," Colbert began, leaning back in his chair. "What's that like? Do the veteran reporters give you a hard time because of your age?" This was an easy opening question, one Amy had prepared for. She gave a small laugh. "Sometimes, but I find that preparation matters more than age, and I've been preparing for this role for a long time. Still, 27 is remarkably young," Colbert pressed. "Were you even born when some of these policies were first implemented?" A few audience members chuckled. Amy smiled, not taking the bait. "Some of our problems have been around for decades, which might be why they haven't been solved yet. Maybe we need some fresh perspectives." This earned her a few approving nods from the audience. Colbert seemed slightly surprised by her poise. "Fair point," he conceded. "Let's talk about those policies. The president's new tariffs on steel and aluminum have economists worried about price increases for American consumers. How do you respond to that?" Amy sat up straighter. "We believe in putting American workers first. These tariffs protect critical industries from unfair foreign competition." Yes, there might be some short-term adjustments in prices, but the long-term benefits for American manufacturing jobs and national security are worth it. Colbert didn't wait for her to finish her thought. But multiple studies show these tariffs will cost more American jobs than they save. The auto industry alone estimates losing 50,000 jobs due to higher material costs. Those studies make assumptions that don't account for the full picture, Amy countered smoothly. When we implemented similar protections in targeted sectors last year, we saw job growth exceed predictions. In Pennsylvania and Ohio, steel manufacturing added nearly 8,000 jobs. She could see Colbert wasn't expecting such specific numbers. He glanced down at his notes. Let's talk about immigration, he said, changing topics abruptly. The administration's new enforcement policies have been called unnecessarily harsh by human rights organizations. How do you justify separating families? The audience murmured, and Amy noticed a few people shaking their heads. This was a more emotionally charged issue, one she needed to handle carefully. First, I want to be clear about something, Amy said, her tone serious but not defensive. No administration wants to separate families. What we want is a secure border and an immigration system that works. The policies you're referring to are temporary measures while we implement broader reforms. But these temporary measures have been in place for months, Colbert interrupted, and reports from detention facilities describe conditions that, if I could finish my thought, Amy said firmly but politely. The audience grew quiet, sensing the shift in energy. Those reports often don't mention the significant improvements we've made in facility conditions, or the fact that processing times have decreased by 40% under this administration. We inherited a broken system, and fixing it takes time. Colbert looked slightly taken aback by her assertiveness. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Time is one thing, but the approach is another, he said. Speaking of approach, let's discuss the president's recent comments about the Supreme Court. He called their ruling on environmental regulations a disaster and suggested they were playing politics. Isn't that undermining a fundamental institution of our democracy? Amy had been waiting for this question. She took a small breath before answering. There's a difference between criticizing a specific decision and attacking the institution itself, she explained. Presidents throughout history, from Jefferson to Roosevelt to Obama, have voiced disagreement with court rulings. That's part of our political dialogue. The president respects the court's authority while disagreeing with this particular interpretation of the Clean Air Act. But his exact words were that the justices were completely wrong and damaging America, Colbert pressed, reading from his notes. That sounds more personal than policy-oriented. I think Americans understand passionate disagreement, Amy replied. The president cares deeply about environmental protection and was expressing his disappointment. But he's also made it clear that the administration will comply with the ruling while seeking legislative solutions. The audience was silent, now watching the back and forth with growing interest. This wasn't the easy takedown some might have expected. Amy remained composed, meeting each question with detailed responses rather than vague talking points. Colbert glanced off stage where a producer was making a circular motion with her hand, the signal to keep going. He looked down at his notes. Again. I understand Qatar recently gifted the president a rather expensive jet, he said, introducing the topic Amy had spotted on his notes earlier. $400 million is quite a generous present. Should Americans be concerned about foreign influence? Amy silently thanked Greg for the rapid talking points he had texted her during makeup. She was prepared for this. That characterization isn't accurate, Amy said confidently. Qatar didn't gift anything to the president personally. They provided a state-of-the-art aircraft to update the aging Air Force One fleet as part of our expanded defense cooperation agreement. The arrangement was fully vetted by ethics officials and security experts, and it saves American taxpayers over $300 million. But the timing right after the president approved major arms sales to Qatar. Those sales were in process for over 18 months, long before any discussion of aircraft upgrades. Amy cut in. And they were approved by bipartisan congressional committees based on our strategic interests in the region. A flash of annoyance crossed Colbert's face at being interrupted. The dynamic in the room was shifting. Some audience members who had come expecting to see the young press secretary flounder were now watching with grudging respect. "Let's switch gears," Colbert said, clearly wanting to find more productive ground. The president's recent comments about enemy of the people in reference to certain media outlets. That phrase has historical connections to authoritarian regimes. Do you think that's appropriate language from a democratic leader? The president was specifically referring to outlets that knowingly publish false information, not the media as a whole, Amy clarified. He's been one of the most accessible presidents in recent history, holding twice as many press conferences as his predecessor in the same time period. Actions speak louder than words, and his actions show deep respect for the free press and their essential role. Colbert leaned forward. But words matter too, especially from a president. These phrases, "I completely agree that words matter," Amy interrupted again, her voice still pleasant but firm. "But that's why context matters too. If you look at the full remarks rather than isolated phrases, his meaning is clear. He distinguishes between journalism that seeks truth and reporting that prioritizes sensationalism." The tension between them was palpable now. Colbert hadn't expected such pushback, and Amy wasn't backing down. He glanced at the producers again, receiving a signal she couldn't see. "We'll be right back with more from White House Press Secretary Amy Peterson after this break," Colbert announced suddenly, turning to the camera with his professional smile. As the applause sign lit up and the audience responded, Amy noticed frantic activity among the production staff. Something was happening, and from the looks on their faces, it wasn't part of the plan. "Cut to commercial," she heard someone say urgently from offstage. In the brief moment before the cameras stopped rolling, Amy maintained her composed expression. But inside, she knew the real confrontation was just beginning. The moment the on-air light went dark, the stage erupted into activity. Producers rushed toward Colbert while stagehands moved quickly around the set. Amy remained seated, her calm exterior hiding her racing thoughts. She watched as Frank Mitchell, the senior producer she had been introduced to earlier, leaned down to whisper urgently in Colbert's ear. Colbert's face showed brief surprise, then resignation. He nodded, stood up, and walked over to Amy with a tight smile. "We need to take a longer break than planned," he said, his tone professional but cool. "Technical issues. Diane will show you back to the green room." Amy knew this was a lie. She had been in television enough to recognize when technical issues were an excuse. "Is there a problem with the second segment?" she asked directly. Before Colbert could answer, Diane appeared at Amy's elbow. "This way, Ms. Peterson," she said, gesturing toward the backstage area. Amy stood but didn't move. "I was told we had a 12-minute segment. We've only done about 7 minutes so far." Frank Mitchell stepped forward, inserting himself between Amy and Colbert. "Unfortunately, we're running behind schedule. We have a musical guest waiting, and we need to make some adjustments to the timing of the show." The audience, still in their seats, watched this exchange with interest. Some had their phones out, recording the unscripted moment. "I see," Amy said, her voice carrying in the now quiet studio. "So these adjustments have nothing to do with the fact that the interview wasn't going as planned?" A murmur ran through the audience. Mitchell's smile tightened. "That's not what's happening here, Ms. Peterson. We simply have time constraints that you didn't have 5 minutes ago," Amy countered, keeping her tone reasonable but firm. She turned slightly to include the audience in the conversation. "I think everyone here deserves transparency. If the segment is being cut because I'm not giving the answers you hoped for, just say so." Colbert, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. "That's not fair, Amy. We run a professional show here, and sometimes adjustments need to be made." "I understand that," Amy replied. "But the timing seems convenient, doesn't it? Right after I challenged some of your characterizations of the administration's policies." The tension in the studio was electric. Audience members exchanged glances, and the whispers grew louder. Several more phones appeared, recording everything. Samantha Reed, another producer, approached with a clipboard. "Stephen, we really need to move on. The band is ready." Colbert nodded, looking relieved at the interruption. "Thank you for coming on the show, Amy," he said, extending his hand in a clear gesture of dismissal. Amy shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for having me, even if briefly," she replied, loud enough for the front rows to hear. As Diane led her backstage, Amy heard Colbert addressing the audience. "We'll be right back with our musical guests after this short break. Stay with us." The backstage area was chaotic. Staff members spoke in hushed, urgent tones, shooting glances at Amy as she was led back to the green room. Inside, she found her bag had already been packed up, a clear signal that her time on the show was over. Amy took out her phone and saw a flood of messages. The top one was from Greg. "What happened? You were doing great and then they cut away." Before she could reply, there was a knock at the door. Karen Montgomery, the senior producer she had spoken to on the phone, entered without waiting for a response. "Ms. Peterson, a car's waiting to take you back to the airport," Karen said, her professional mask firmly in place. "I'd like to understand what just happened," Amy said calmly. "Was there actually a technical issue, or was my segment cut because I wasn't playing along with the narrative?" Karen's expression didn't change. As Frank explained, we had scheduling issues that required adjustments to the show's timeline. "That's not an answer, and we both know it," Amy replied. She stood up, gathering her belongings. "But it's your show. I just think your audience deserves more respect than that." "The audience comes to be entertained," Karen said, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. "Not for political sparring. Is that what you think I was doing?" "Sparring?" Amy asked. "I was having a substantive conversation about important issues that affect Americans' lives. If that's not suitable for your show, perhaps you shouldn't invite government officials as guests." Karen's professional veneer cracked slightly. "Look, we expected you to stick to talking points, not challenge Stephen on his own show. So you invited me under false pretenses," Amy said, nodding as if confirming something she already knew. "You wanted a young, inexperienced press secretary you could embarrass for ratings, not someone who could actually defend her positions." "That's not," Karen began, then stopped herself. "Your car is waiting." As Amy walked through the backstage area toward the exit, she noticed several staff members watching her, some with surprise, others with what looked like grudging respect. One young production assistant even gave her a small, secret thumbs up when her supervisor wasn't looking. Outside, the Blacktown car waited as promised. As Amy approached, she saw a small group of people had gathered near the stage door, audience members who had left during the commercial break, perhaps hoping to see what was happening. "That's her," someone said as Amy emerged. "They cut her." Segment short. A young woman stepped forward. "I was in the audience. You were doing great in there. Why did they stop the interview?" Amy smiled politely. "You'd have to ask the producers about that. I was just as surprised as you were." "They didn't like that you were holding your own," an older man in the group said. "Not what they expected." More people were gathering now, many with phones recording. Amy knew she needed to be careful. Anything she said could be online within minutes. "I appreciate the support," she said diplomatically. "I came here hoping for a respectful exchange of ideas. That's what democracy is all about, being able to discuss different perspectives." "Will you be back on the show?" someone called out. Amy laughed lightly. "I think that's highly unlikely, but I'm always open to constructive conversation." As she got into the car, Amy's phone rang. It was Greg. "Are you okay?" he asked when she answered. We saw the feed cut abruptly. "I'm fine," Amy replied as the car pulled away from the curb. "But they didn't like that I wasn't an easy target. They cut the segment and are sending me back to DC." "This is already blowing up online," Greg told her. "Someone in the audience posted video of you questioning the producers about why they were cutting your segment. It's being shared everywhere." Amy closed her eyes briefly. "That's not what I intended." "No, but it might work in our favor," Greg said. "You came across as reasonable and they looked like they were silencing you. The president has already been briefed. He wants to talk to you when you land." As the car navigated through the busy New York streets toward the airport, Amy's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. She saw messages from colleagues, friends, and even reporters seeking comment on what was now being called her removal from The Late Show. One text caught her attention, from Linda Blackwell. You didn't just survive their trap. You exposed it. Well done. Amy looked out the window at the city lights, feeling a strange mix of emotions. This wasn't how she had expected the evening to go. She had prepared for tough questions, even hostility, but not for being cut off entirely. Yet somehow being silenced had given her a more powerful voice than any full interview could have. Her phone rang again, a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. Ms. Peterson, this is Susan Carter from the National Review. I'd like to get your side of what happened tonight at the Late Show. Amy took a deep breath. The aftermath was just beginning. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Amy's Georgetown apartment as she sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone. It had been 3 days since the fateful appearance on the Late Show, and the story showed no signs of fading from public attention. If anything, it had grown larger. Her television played quietly in the background, tuned to a morning news program where 2 commentators were discussing the incident yet again. What we saw was a clear example of media bias, said Nicole Bradley, a conservative analyst. They invited a young female press secretary on the show expecting an easy target, and when she held her own, they literally cut her microphone. That's not what happened, countered Eric Thompson, the liberal counterpart. The show cited timing issues which happen all the time in television. Not everything is a conspiracy. Amy turned down the volume with a sigh. She had heard these same arguments repeated across every network for days now. Her phone buzzed with a text from Greg. Morning briefing in 1 hour. The president wants to see you first. She finished her coffee, dressed in a crisp gray suit, and headed to the White House. The security guards greeted her with more deference than usual. Bill, the guard who had wished her luck on the day of the interview, gave her a thumbs up. You showed them, Ms. Peterson, he said with a smile. Just doing my job, Bill, she replied modestly. In the West Wing, staff members nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even stopped to offer quiet congratulations. Amy found it strange how this unplanned confrontation had suddenly elevated her status more than any carefully crafted press briefing ever could. The president was waiting in the Oval Office, watching a news report about the incident on a muted television. He turned as Amy entered and gestured for her to sit. 3 days, and they're still talking about it, he said, pointing to the screen. You've become quite the celebrity, Amy. Not by choice, sir, she replied. I went there to discuss policy, not to create drama. The president smiled. Sometimes the most effective moments are the unplanned ones. The network released their statement yesterday. Amy nodded. She had read the Late Show's official statement multiple times. It cited scheduling conflicts and timing issues as the reason for the shortened segment and denied any bias or attempt to silence her. Few people seemed convinced. Their viewership is down 12% since the incident, the president continued, and your approval rating is up 17 points. People respect someone who stands their ground respectfully. What happens now? Amy asked. The story will fade eventually, but the relationship with that network is probably damaged beyond repair. Let it be, the president advised. There are more important things to focus on. The tariff policy rollout continues next week, and we need to prepare for the NATO summit. This was just one moment, albeit an instructive one. After meeting with the president, Amy headed to the briefing room for her morning press conference. The room was more crowded than usual, with additional reporters squeezed into the back and standing along the walls. All eyes followed her as she walked to the podium. Good morning, Amy began. Before I take questions, I'd like to address something. Many of you want to ask about what happened on the Late Show 3 nights ago. I understand that, but I'd prefer to focus on the substantive issues facing our country today. There's important work to be done, and that's where our attention should be. Despite her request, the first 5 questions were all about the incident. Amy answered them briefly and diplomatically, refusing to criticize the show directly or play the victim. Finally, a reporter from the Washington Post changed the subject to the upcoming NATO summit, and Amy gave him a grateful smile. After the briefing, Linda Blackwell caught up with Amy in the hallway. Masterfully handled, Linda said. You've turned down every major interview request about the incident, haven't you? All 17 of them, Amy confirmed. I don't want to be known as the press secretary who got kicked off Colbert. I want to be known for communicating the administration's policies effectively. Linda nodded approvingly. Smart. But you should know several other late-night hosts have reached out. They want you on their shows now. Amy laughed. I imagine they do. Nothing like a controversy to boost ratings. One in particular might be worth considering, Linda suggested. Alan Richards has a more balanced approach. His audience includes people across the political spectrum. If you want to actually discuss policy rather than create more drama, that could be the right venue. Amy considered this as they walked. I'll think about it, but not right away. Let's get through the NATO summit first. That evening, Amy returned to her apartment to find a small package waiting at her door. Inside was a framed cartoon from a major newspaper, showing her standing tall at a microphone while a caricature of Colbert tried unsuccessfully to reach the mute button. A note was attached. Proud of you, Dad. Amy smiled and placed the frame on her bookshelf. Her phone buzzed with a text from Susan Carter, the reporter who had called her in the car after the show. My profile on you runs tomorrow. Front, page Sunday edition. I think you'll be pleased. Amy had given Susan an exclusive interview, her only extended comments on the incident. She had chosen Susan carefully, respecting her reputation for fairness despite her conservative leanings. The decision had raised eyebrows among some White House staff who preferred more friendly outlets, but Amy had stood firm. She was about to put her phone away when it rang. The caller ID showed it was Alan Richards' producer. Hello? Amy answered, cautiously. Ms. Peterson, this is Kevin Lawson from the night desk with Alan Richards. I'm calling to formally invite you to appear on our show next month. Alan was impressed with how you handled yourself on The Late Show and would like to offer you a full 30-minute segment. No interruptions, no surprise topics. Amy sat on her couch considering the offer. That's generous, Mr. Lawson. But I need to know something first. Is this invitation because you think I'll create controversy and boost your ratings? There was a pause before Lawson answered. Honestly, your appearance would certainly attract viewers, but Alan genuinely wants to have a substantive conversation about policy. No ambushes, no gotcha questions. I appreciate the transparency, Amy replied. Let me think about it and get back to you next week. After hanging up, Amy walked to her window and looked out at the Washington skyline. 1 week ago, she had been just another press secretary, doing her job competently but anonymously. Now she had become a symbol in the ongoing debate about media bias and political discourse. It wasn't a role she had sought, but perhaps it was one she could use effectively. If her unexpected moment in the spotlight could somehow help elevate the level of political conversation, maybe something good could come from it after all. Her phone buzzed with another message from Greg. You're trending again. Amy Unfiltered is now the top political hashtag. The president says well done. Amy smiled and put her phone away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new briefings, new policies to explain. The incident would eventually fade from public memory, but the lessons it taught about preparation, poise under pressure, and standing up for herself would remain with her. In the unpredictable world of politics and media, those were skills worth having. As the city lights began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Amy Peterson, the youngest press secretary in American history, turned away from the window and began preparing her notes for tomorrow's briefing. The spotlight might be on her now, but the real work, continued.